PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi.
The World Rapid and Blitz Championships took place in New York between Christmas and New Year. And, well, I'd like to concentrate on the World Blitz, and let's cut to the chase. I want to look at the final between Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen. 4 games were scheduled to be played in this final. 3 minutes plus 2 seconds each time the players made a move. Okay, here's the first game. So Nepo playing white, Carlsen playing black, and it's a Sicilian. What kind of a Sicilian? Well, Nepo goes for the Rossolimo. Very, very popular variation. White develops really quickly. Now, in my anti-Sicilians course, I recommend knight f6 in this position to challenge white's centre straight away and to start developing on the king side. g6 was played by Carlsen. Of course, this is one of the main lines. Castles, bishop g7, and now rook e1 from Nepo. So this is quite a positional way to handle the variation. I think c3 is the most dangerous move. That's the move I've always played as white here, and has a decent reputation. No doubt Carlsen was ready for it, but it's a tricky move. White just wants to build that centre really quickly. But rook e1 played by Nepo, quite positional. e5 from Carlsen. So if black gets in knight e7 and castles quickly, then everything is fine. But Nepo exchanges on c6 and aims to target that pawn on c5. Queen e7 from Carlsen. So why has he played that? Well, he wants to be able to play the knight to f6. And in order to do that, he had to protect the e-pawn first. So Nepo gets on with his queenside play straight away. So this is all about surrounding this pawn on c5, so it's not so easy for black to play b6. So bishop e3, there you go. That pawn is the target. Rook d8 from Carlsen. So putting a bit of pressure here. And queen c1 from Nepo. Steps away from the rook on the d file. And also, looks to support this bishop on the diagonal as well. Now, Nepo has faced this has had this position before as white, and his opponent played knight e8. I mean, this is very, very typical maneuver in this kind of position. So this knight bounces round to the e6 square. I think it's a very reasonable way for black to play, actually. But Carlsen plays in a more direct way. He plays c4. And again, this is one of the strategic aims in this position type, that it can be very useful to break things open in the middle, and you're getting rid of your double pawn with c4, attacking white's pawn chain. So strategically, absolutely normal. So if that's taken, of course, then you can see that that pawn can be taken there. So rook a3 defends the d-pawn, an exchange, and well, you can see that, that has really improved Carlsen's pawn structure and damaged white's structure, because, that's a slight weakness now. And knight h5 from Carlsen. And, after this move, I would have thought Carlsen would be very happy with the outcome of the opening. So this knight is often, well, I wouldn't say a problem for black in this position, but it needs to travel somewhere else. So I've already shown that maneuver, if it comes via e8, c7 to e6. But knight h5 in this position is really nice because you're heading for the outpost on f4, and if that's taken, then that bishop will fly down the diagonal. And the knight looks really menacing from f4, looking at d3, looking at g2. And of course, white doesn't want to play g3, which weakens those light squares. So bishop g5 played by Nepo. So what's he doing with this? Well, he's hoping that perhaps Carlsen will close the diagonal with f6 and then the bishop will just drop back. But Carlsen goes for bishop f6 and an exchange. And the queen comes to a nice position, just putting a little bit of pressure here. Looks quite nice. And queen c5 from Nepo. Well, that doesn't look bad. Both sides have achieved something over the past few moves. Nepo will be happy with white that he's exchanged off the bishop pair. And this queen puts a bit of pressure on the pawn on a7. But Carlsen will be pretty happy with the position of the queen, and this knight is about to leap into f4. But first of all, that pawn needs protecting. So rook e8, knight d2. Yeah, knight comes into play, finally. Bishop g4. Yeah, the bishop doesn't really have a good diagonal to go to. So I think it's basically okay to exchange it off here. But there's more to it than that. After h3, this is the game continuation. Carlsen exchanged, and you can see that with that pawn on h3, that's a little bit of a target, and straight away there's a threat to take on h3 and take on f3. So I think for a blitz game, this is, very, very good play actually from both sides. Certainly no blunders, and it's all very, very logical. And again, very logical move from Nepo. King steps up to protect that pawn, so no tactic. I think this is a really interesting moment in the game. So, both sides have developed. It's the early middle game. It's black to play here, Carlsen to play. So here's my question for you. Hopefully you haven't seen this game, or you flicked through it so you don't remember this exact position. How do you play with black here? And I think it's a really interesting decision from Carlsen over this next move. Okay, so you have a think. I'll have a drink. Cheers. Black to play. There's more than one decent move here. It's possible just to play a6. Obviously, this pawn is a slight issue. Black would love to play the rook into the middle to put some more pressure on d3. You could just go a6 here. I can imagine Carlsen might have been a little bit reluctant to do that because it sort of means this pawn is permanently sort of fixed on b7. But that's still playable for black because it kind of balances out when there's a weak pawn on d3. But no, Carlsen went for b6. He's trying to stir things up here. So that was exchanged. And if queen b6, then rook b8 hits the queen, and then rook takes b2. And, in a blitz game, that could be tricky for white. That rook can't be budged from the second rank at the moment. There's a little bit of pressure here. In combination with the queen and the knight, that could be quite interesting. Certainly in a blitz game, you'd sort of think twice about playing that with white. But Nepo goes for rook takes rook. And again, this had to be anticipated by Carlsen. Pawn takes queen, because if rook takes, then that pawn could perhaps be taken, or certainly the e-pawn actually. So Carlsen took the queen, and rook takes rook check, and king g7. So Carlsen obviously anticipated this new kind of position, and he had to judge, is the queen better than the two rooks? We've got this material balance here. Well, one thing is that in trying to judge this position beforehand, one thing is that the queen and knight are often a very powerful combination. And, okay, although, from a strict material balance, you could say two rooks worth 10 points against a queen worth roughly 9, so white can be better sometimes with two rooks against a queen. But here, well, for the moment, the rooks aren't working together. I mean, if they were doubled on the 7th or something like that, that would be a different story. But they're not working together at the moment. And there are targets in the position, on the king side as well. Queens love targets. So it's a tricky, I think it's a trickier position for the rooks than the queen, because Carlsen understands that the queen is one kind of incredibly powerful unit, whereas for the two rooks and the knights and the pawns and the king, these are all kind of disparate elements a collection of pieces that need to coordinate well, whereas the queen can just fire all over the board, like a guided missile, aiming for these weaknesses. Okay, so let's see how Nepo handles this. I mean, objectively, it's around about even, but yeah, in practice, not so easy for the rooks. So let's see, rook e3. So kind of makes sense to protect these pieces. But queen d6 moves over. Knight e1. Okay, so that protects this one, because queen and knight were attacking it. So what should black do? Maybe maneuver the queen over to attack this pawn? No, Carlsen plays in a much more direct way. He's a very direct player. c4. So that allows the queen in, and you can see, well, this is exactly what the queen wants. It's hitting lots of pieces here. Now, the rook is protected at the moment, as is the knight, but those pawns, okay, the king comes back to protect this one, and then queen takes b2. But the queen is broken in. That's really important. And this is now tricky for white to handle, and you can see those rooks still aren't coordinating, not protecting each other. Rook c8 hits the c-pawn. So Carlsen, well, I think quite prudently brought the queen back, and that pushes the rook away. And the queen came back again. Keeps an eye on the knight. Looks at the c-pawn as well. And all the while, that knight is hanging around. It's really difficult. I mean, in any form of chess, but in Blitz particularly, when you've got that, and you've always got to watch out for knight forks. Very tricky. So the knight came off the back rank, and queen takes c4. So Carlsen has won a pawn. Yeah, by the way, if knight takes, then check, and queen f1 threatens mate. That's very unpleasant. So Nepo played rook d7. So he's starting to try to get some play against black's king. A check. The rook came back, and queen c3. So that knight might take on h3. Remember, there's a loose knight here. The knight might come to d3. So queen also looks at the rook. Very difficult to handle this position with white when that queen is creating little threats. So the rook came up again, and that's an indication that Nepo would be happy with a draw in this position. I think that's quite clear. This is just more difficult for white to play than black. But Carlsen doesn't want to check again on c1. He plays queen b2. That's a great lurking move. Just hanging around, hoping something is going to turn up. Perhaps, one of these checks on the back rank will be useful. Also keeps an eye here. And who knows, this c-pawn might have the chance to advance at some point. Defense is really tricky here. And perhaps it's best to bring the rook back. But this doesn't solve all the problems. That queen keeps lurking. You can keep pushing it, but this is still a very tricky position to handle. In any case, Nepo sees the chance to counterattack and plays knight g5. And now Carlsen's in. Queen c1 and queen f1. We're back to this position again. Well, perhaps Nepo had hoped that something would turn up in this position. And Carlsen has to be very careful here. I mean, if you had just seconds on the clock, would you be tempted to bring the king up to hit the knight? You're hitting the knight and threatening mate on g2. But if black plays like this, then rook g3 turns the tables completely, defends the knight, and defends the knight, defends g2, and threatens rook h7 mate. But Carlsen played king g8, and now Nepo is in huge trouble. If the rook comes to g3 to protect both of those, both g2 and g5, then knight e2, threatening queen g1 mate, and there's no good answer to that. If the knight hops back, then king takes rook. And h4, well, this leads to disaster. As I said, queen and knight are a deadly combination. That's checkmate. Okay, so after king g8, Nepo had to take the knight. Now, if the rook and knight can coordinate, then there are drawing chances. But with this passed pawn, it's going to be tricky. And particularly when that's a beautiful pawn chain. And then the king is still not great here. And yeah, Nepo cracks completely. He plays e5. Would have been better to try knight d4 and put the knight on f5, but black should win. But after e5, well, Carlsen's technique was superb. He made sure that that knight was in trouble. And started pushing the c-pawn. And this is now absolutely hopeless. And then f3, well, could have just pushed the c-pawn, but he manages to create threats against the king as well. So let's just see very quickly how the game finished. There we go, he's broken through. Lots of checks, but the king approaches the rook. The checks would run out very swiftly. Pawn takes pawn, queen takes, and here Nepo resigned because after this, well, you pick up the knight. Long overdue. Thought that knight was going to drop quite a few moves ago. But anyway, I mean, Carlsen's technique was perfect there, actually. I thought that was a fascinating game. And I have to say that the quality for a Blitz game, I repeat, it's 3 minutes plus 2 seconds increment. I think the quality was absolutely superb. And the way that Carlsen manages to sort of stir up trouble, I thought was absolutely fascinating. When he played, for example, b6, great move. He judged that superbly. That the queen would be stronger than the two rooks. Great stuff. So that was the first Blitz game in their 4-game match. In the second Blitz game, Carlsen won very smoothly. Let's just have a very quick look at that. It's got these very nice hanging pawns backed up by the two bishops, and well, it's a very unfortunate position actually of queen and bishop. F3, excellent move, hitting the bishop, and Nepo just had to give up a piece, and obviously that's losing because if the bishop retreats, then bishop d3 traps the queen. Triumph for the bishops and a nice central pawns as well. So after 2 games in this 4-game match, Carlsen was 2-0 up. In the next video, I'll show you what happened in the remaining 2 games in that 4-game match. See you soon.